Book 5 of Plato's Republic. Such is good and true city or state, and the good and true man is of the same pattern. And if this is right, every other is wrong. And the evil is one which affects not only the ordering of the state, but also the regulation of the individual soul, and exhibited in 4 forms. What are they? He said. I was proceeding to tell the order in which the 4 evil forms appeared to me to succeed one another, when Polemarchus, who was sitting a little way off, just beyond Adeimantus, began to whisper to him. Stretching forth his hand, he took a hold of the upper part of his coat by the shoulder, and drew him towards him, leaning forward himself so as to be quite close, and saying something in his ear, of which I only caught the words. Shall we let him off, or what shall we do? Certainly not, said Adeimantus, raising his voice. Who is it, I said, with whom you are refusing to let off? You, he said. I repeated, why am I especially not to be let off? Why, he said, we think you are lazy, and mean to cheat us out of the whole chapter, which is a very important part of the story. You fancy that we shall not notice your airy way of proceeding, as if it were self-evident to everyone, that in the matter of women and children, friends have all things in common. And was I not right, Adeimantus? Yes, he said, but what is right in this particular case, like everything else, requires to be explained. Community may be of many kinds. Please, therefore, to say what sort of community you mean. We've been long expecting that you would tell us something about the family life of your citizens, how they will bring children into the world, rear them when they have arrived, and, in general, what is the nature of this community of women and children. For we are of opinion that the right or wrong management of such matters will have a great and paramount influence of the state, for good and for evil. And now, since the question is still undetermined, and you are taking in hand another state, we have resolved, as you heard, not to let you go until you give an account of all this. To that resolution, said Glaucon, you may regard me as saying, agreed. And without much ado, said Thrasymachus, you may consider us all to be equally agreed. I said, you know not what you are doing in thus assailing me. What an argument you were raising about the state. Just as I thought that I had finished, and I was only too glad that I had laid this question to sleep, and I was reflecting on how fortunate I was in your acceptance of what I then said, you asked me to begin again at the very foundation, ignorant of what a hornet's nest of words you were stirring. Now I foresaw this gathering trouble, and I avoided it. For what purpose do you conceive that we have come here, said Thrasymachus, to look for gold or to hear discourse? Yes, but discourse should have a limit. Yes, Socrates, said Glaucon, and the whole life is the only limit which wise men assign to the hearing of such discourse. But never mind about it. Think hard yourself, and answer the questions in your own way. What sort of community of women and children is this which to prevail among our guardians? And how shall we manage the period between birth and education, which seems to require greatest care? Tell us how these things will be. Yes, my simple friend, but the answer is the reverse of easy. Many more doubts arise about this than our previous conclusion. For the practicality of what is said may be doubted, and looked in another point of view. Whether the scheme, if ever so practicable, would be for the best is also doubtful. Here I feel a reluctance to approach the subject, lest our aspiration, my dear friend, should turn out to be a dream only. Fear not, he replied, for your audience will not be hard upon you. They are not skeptical or hostile. I said, my good friend, I suppose what you mean to encourage me with these words. Yes, he said. Then let me tell you about that you are doing just the reverse. The encouragement which you offer would have all very well had I myself believed that I know what I was talking about. To declare the truth about the matters of high interest which a man honors and loves among wise men who love him need occasion no fear of faltering in his mind, but to carry on an argument which you are yourself only hesitatingly inquirer, which, in my condition, is a dangerous and slippery thing. And the danger is not that I shall be laughed at, of which the fear would be childish, but that I shall miss the truth where I most needed to be sure of my footing, and drag my friends after me in my fall. And I pray Nemesis not to visit upon me the words which I am going to utter, for I do indeed believe that to be an voluntary homicide is the less of crime than the deceiver about beauty or goodness or justice in the matter of laws, and that is the risk which I would rather run among enemies than among friends, and therefore you do well to encourage. Glaucon laughed and said, well then, Socrates, in case you in your argument do us any serious injury, you shall be acquitted beforehand of homicide, and shall not be held to be a deceiver. Take courage then and speak. Well, I said, the law says that when a man is acquitted, he is free from guilt, and then what holds at law may hold in argument. Why should you mind? Well, I replied, I suppose that I must retrace my steps and say what I perhaps ought to have said before in proper place. The part of the men that has been played out, and now properly enough comes the turn of women. Of them I will proceed to speak, and the more readily since I am invited by you. For men born and educated like our citizens, the only way, in my opinion, of arriving at the right conclusion about the possession and use of women and children is to follow the path on which we originally started, when we said that the men were to be guardians and watchdogs of the herd. True. Let us further suppose the birth and education of our women to be subject to similar or nearly similar regulations. Then we shall see whether the result accords with our design. What do you mean? What I mean may be put into the form of a question, I said. Are dogs divided into he's and she's, or do they both share equally in hunting and keeping watch and other duties of dog? Or do we entrust the males the entire and exclusive care of the flocks, while we leave the females at home, under the idea that the bearing and suckling their puppy is labor enough for them? No, he said, they shall share alike. The only difference between them and the males are stronger and the females weaker. You can use different animals for the same purposes, unless they are bred and fed in the same way. You cannot. Then, if women are to have the same duties as men, they must have the same nurture and education. Yes, the education which was assigned to men was music and gymnastics. Yes, the women must be taught music and gymnastic and also the art of war, which they must practice like that in men. That is an inference, I suppose. I should rather expect, I said, that several of our proposals, if they are carried out, being unusual, may appear ridiculous. No doubt about it. Yes, and the most ridiculous thing of all will be the sight of women naked on the palistra, exercising with the men, especially when they are no longer young. They certainly will not have a vision of beauty, any more than the enthusiastic old man who, in spite of wrinkles and ugliness, continues to frequent the gymnasium. Yes, indeed, he said. According to present notions, the proposal will be thought ridiculous. But then, I said, as we determine to speak our minds, we must not fear the jests of the wits which will be directed against this sort of innovation. How they will talk of the women's attainments, both in music and gymnastics, and above all about the wearing armor and riding upon horseback. Very true, he replied. Having begun, we must go forward to the rough places of the law, at the same time beginning of these gentlemen for once in their life to be serious. Not long ago, as we shall remind them, the Hellenes were of the opinion, which is still generally received among the barbarians, the sight of a naked man was ridiculous and improper, and when the first Cretians and then the Lacedaemonians introduced the custom, the wits of that day might equally have ridiculed the innovation, no doubt. But when experience showed that to let all things be uncovered was far better than to cover them up, and the ludicrous effect to the outward eye vanished before the better principle which reason asserted, and the man was perceived to be a fool, who directs the shafts of his ridicule at any other sight but that of folly or vice, or seriously inclines to weigh the beautiful by any other standard but that of the good. Very true, he replied. First, then, whether the question is to be put in jest or earnest, let us come to an understanding about the nature of woman. Is she capable of sharing either wholly or partially in the actions of men, or not at all? And is the art of war one of those arts in which she can or cannot share? That will be the best way of commencing the inquiry, will probably lead to the fairest conclusion. That will be much the best way. Shall we take the other side first and begin arguing against ourselves? In this matter the adversary's position will not be undefended. Why not, you said. Then let us put a speech into the mouths of our opponents. They will say, Socrates and Glaucon, no adversary needs convict you, for you yourselves, at the first foundation of the state, admitted the principle that everybody was to do the one work suited to his own nature, and certainly, if I am not mistaken, such an admission was made by us. And do not the natures of men and women differ very much indeed? And we shall reply, of course they do. Then we shall be asked, whether the tasks assigned to men and to women should not be different, and such as are agreeable to their different natures. Certainly they should. But so, have you not fallen into a serious inconsistency in saying that men and women, whose natures are so entirely different, ought to perform the same actions? What defense will you make for us, my good sir, against anyone who offers these objections? That is not an easy question to answer when asked suddenly, and I do beg of you to draw out the case on our side. These are objections, Glaucon, and there are many others of the like kind, which I foresaw law. They made me afraid and reluctant to take hand any law about the possession or nurture of women and children. By Zeus, he said, the problem to be solved is anything but easy. Why, yes, I said, but the fact is that when we will hope that Arion's dolphin or some other miraculous help may save us. For discussion. Yes, he replied. Such is very often the case, but what has it to do with same natures? Why no, he said. That was never considered by us. I said, suppose that, by way of illustration, we were to ask the question whether there is not an opposition in nature between bald men and hairy men, and if this is admitted by us, then, if bald men are cobblers, we bid the hairy guardians and their wives ought to have the same pursuit. Very true, he said. Next, we shall ask you a question. When you spoke on the nature gifted or not gifted in any respect, did you mean to say that one man will acquire a thing easily, another with difficulty? A little learning will lead one to discover a great deal, whereas the other, after much study and applications, no sooner learns that he forgets, or again, did you mean that the one has the body in which a good servant to his mind, while the body of another is a hindrance to him? Would not these be the sort of differences which distinguish the man gifted by nature from the one who is ungifted? No one will deny that. And can you mention any pursuit of mankind in which the male sex has not all these gifts and qualities in a higher degree than a female? Need I waste time in speaking of the art of weaving, and the management of pancakes and preserves, in which womankind does really appear to be great, and in which for her to be virtue of his sizes, and another is unwarlike and hates gymnastics? Certainly. And one woman is a philosopher. As we were saying before, there is nothing unnatural in assigning music and gymnastics to the wives of the guardians. To that point we come round again. Certainly not. The law which we enacted was agreeable to the law. You have answered me, I replied. Well, and we may not further say that our guardians are best assigned to the women, who are in the weaker natures, but on other respects their duties are to be the same. As for the man who laughs at the naked woman exercising their bodies, there will be the best of sayings, that is useful is the noble, and the hurtful is the base. Very true, common. And therefore you will please to give the defense of both. Well, I said, I submit to my fate, yet grant me a little favor. Let me foast my mind with a dream as day dreamers are to them. Assuming that they... First of all, then, if you have no objection, I will endeavor with your help to consider the individual houses and meet at common meals. None of them will have anything specially his or her own. They will be together, and will be brought up together, and they will associate at gymnastic exercises. And so they will be drawn by necessity of their natures to have intercourse with each other. Necessity is not too strong a word, I think. Yes, he said, necessity, not geometrical, but another sort of necessity which lovers know, and which is far more convincing and constraining to the mass of mankind. True, I said, and this, Clisson, like all the rest, must be proceeded after an orderly fashion. In the city of the blessed, licentiousness is an unholy thing, which the rulers will forbid. Yes, he said, and it ought not to be permitted. Then clearly the next thing will be to make matrimony sacred in the highest degree. What is most beneficial will be deemed sacred. Exactly. And how can marriages be made most beneficial? That is a question which I put to you, because I see your house dogs for hunting, and the nobler sort of birds not a few. Now I beseech you, do you tell me, have you ever attended to the pairing and breeding? In what particulars? Why, in the first place, although they are a good sort, are not some better than the other? True. And do you breed them all indifferently, or do you take care to breed from the best only? From the best. And do you take the oldest or the youngest, or those of ripe age? I choose only those of ripe age. And if care was not taken in the breeding, your dogs and birds would greatly deteriorate? Certainly. And the same of horses and animals in general? Undoubtedly. Good heavens, my dear friend, I said. What consummate skills will our rulers need if the same principle holds of the human species? Certainly. The same principle holds. But why does this involve any particular skill? Because, I said, our rulers will often have to practice upon the body corporate with medicines. Now you know that what patients do not require medicines, but have only to be put under a regimen. The inferior sort of the practitioners deemed to be good enough. But when medicine has to be given, then the doctor should be more of a man. That is quite true, he said. But what are you alluding? I mean, I replied, that our rulers will find considerable doses of falsehood and deceit necessary for good of their subjects. We were saying that the use of these things regarded as medicines might be at an advantage, and we were right. And this lawful use of this seems likely often needed in the regulation of marriages and births. How so? Why, I said, the principle has been already laid down. The best of either sex should be united with the best as often, and the inferior with the inferior, as seldom as possible, and that they should rear the offspring of the one sort of union, but not of the other, if the flock is to be maintained in first-rate condition. Now these goings-on must be secret, what the rulers only know, or there will be further danger of our herd, as guardians may be termed, breaking out into rebellion. Very true. Had we not better appoint certain festivals at which we will bring together the brides and bridegrooms, and sacrifices will be offered in suitable hymeneal songs composed by our poet? The number of weddings is a matter which must be left to the discretion of the rulers. whose aim will be to preserve the average population? There are many other things which they will have to consider, such as the effects of war and diseases and any similar agencies, in order as far as this is possible to prevent the state from becoming either too large or too small. Certainly, he replied. We shall have to invent some ingenious kind of lot, which the less worthy may draw on each occasion, our bringing them together, and then they will accuse their own ill luck and not the rulers. To be sure, he said, and I think that our braver and better youth, besides their other honors and rewards, might have greater faculties of intercourse, the women given them. Their bravery will be a reason, and such fathers ought to have as many sons as possible. True. And the proper officers, whether male or female or both, for officers are to be held by women as well as by men. Yes. The proper officers will take the offspring of the good parents to the pen or the fold, and they will deposit them with certain nurses who dwell in a separate quarter. But the offspring of the inferior, or of the better when they chance to be deformed, will be put away in some mysterious, unknown place, as they should be. Yes, he said, that must be done if the breed of the guardians is to be kept pure. They will provide for their nature, and will bring the mothers to the fold when they are full of milk, taking the greatest possible care that no mother recognizes her own child, and others wet nurses may be engaged if more are required. Care will also be taken to the process of suckling shall not be protracted too long, and the mothers will have no getting up at night or other trouble, but will hand over all sorts of these things to the nurses and attendants. Do you suppose the wives of our guardians to have a fine, easy time of it when they are having children? Why, said I, and so they ought. Let us, however, proceed with our scheme. We were saying that the parent should be in the prime of life. Very true. And what is the prime of life? May it not be defined as a period about 20 years in a woman's life and 30 in a man? Which years do you mean to include? A woman, I said, at 20 years of age may begin to bear children to the state, and continue to bear them until 40. A man may begin at 25, when he has passed the point in which the pulse of life beats quickest, and continues to beget children until he is 55. Certainly, he said, both in men and women these years are the prime of physical as well as intellectual vigor. Anyone above or below the prescribed age who takes part in the public hymeneal shall be said to have done an unholy and unrighteous thing, child of which he is the father, if it steals into life, will have been conceived under auspices very unlike the sacrifices and prayers which each hymeneal priest and the priestess in the whole city will offer, that the new generation may be better and more useful than their good and useful parent, whereas his children will be offspring of darkness and strange lust. Very true, he replied. And the same law will apply to any one of those within the prescribed age, forms a connection with any woman in the prime of life, without sanction of the rulers. For we shall say that he's raising up a bastard to the state, uncertified and unconsecrated. Very true, he said. This applies, however, only to those who are within a specific age. After that we will allow them to range at will, except that a man may not marry his daughter, or his daughter's daughter, or his mother's mother, and women, on the other hand, are prohibited from marrying their sons or fathers, or sons' sons, or fathers' fathers, and so on in either direction. And we grant all this, accompanying the permission with strict orders to prevent any embryo which may come into being from seeing the light. And if any force a way to the birth, the parent must understand that the offspring of such a union cannot be maintained and arranged accordingly. That also, he said, is a reasonable proposition. But how will they know who are the fathers and daughters, and so on? They will never know. The way will be this. Dating from the day of the hymeneal, the bridegroom who was then married will call all the male children who were born in the 7th and 10th month afterwards his sons, the female children his daughters, and they will call him father, and he will call the children his grandchildren, and they will call the elder generation grandfathers and grandmothers. All who were begotten at the time when their fathers and mothers came together will be called their brothers and sisters, and these, as I was saying, forbidden to intermarry. This, however, is not to be understood as an absolute prohibition of the marriage of brothers and sisters, if the law favors them, and they receive the sanction of the Pythian oracle. The law will allow them. Quite right, he replied. Such is a scheme, Glasson, according to which the guardians of our state are to have wives and families in common. And now you would have the argument show that this community is consistent with the rest of our policy, and also that nothing can be better, would you not? Yes, certainly. Shall we try to find a common basis by asking ourselves what ought to be the chief aim of the legislator in making laws in the organization of a state? What is the greatest good? What is the greatest evil? And then consider whether our previous description has the stamp of good or of evil. By all means. Can there be any greater evil than discord and distraction and plurality, where unity ought to reign, or any greater good than the bond of unity? There cannot. And there is unity where there is community of pleasures and pains, where all citizens are glad or grieved on the same occasion of joy and sorrow. No doubt. Yes, and whether things is not common, but only private feeling, a state is disorganized. When you have one half of the world triumphing,
and other plunged in grief at the same events happening in the city or the citizen. Certainly, such differences commonly originate in a disagreement about the terms mine and not mine, his and not his. Exactly so. And is not the best ordered state in which the greatest number of persons apply the term mine and not mine in the same way to the same thing? Quite true. Or that again which most nearly approaches to the condition of the individual, as in the body, when but a finger of one of us is hurt, the whole frame, drawn towards the soul as the center and forming one kingdom under the ruling power therein, feels the hurt and sympathizes altogether with the part affected. We may say that the man has a pain in his finger, and that the same expression is used about any other part of the body, which has a sensation of pain at suffering or of pleasure at the alleviated of suffering. Very true, he said, and I agree with you that the best ordered state there is the nearest approach to this common feeling which you describe. Then when any one of our citizens experiences any good or evil, the whole state will make his case their own, and will either rejoice or sorrow with him. Yes, he said, that is what will happen in a well-ordered state. It will now be time, I said, for us to return to our state and see whether this or some other form is most in accordance with our fundamental principles. Very good. Our state, like every other, has rulers and subjects. True. All of whom will call one another citizens? Of course. But is there not another name which people give to their rulers in other states? Generally they call them masters, but in democratic states they simply call them rulers. And in our state, what other names besides that of citizens do the people give to their rulers? They are called saviors and helpers, he replied. What do rulers call the people? They are maintainers and foster fathers. And what do they call them in other states? Slaves. And what do rulers call one another in other states? Fellow rulers. And what in ours? Fellow guardians. Did you ever know an example in any other state of a ruler who would speak of one of his colleagues as a friend and another as not being his friend? Yes, very often. And a friend he regards and describes as one who he has an interest, another as a stranger, and exactly who has no interest. Exactly. But would another of your guardians think or speak of any other guardian as a stranger? Certainly he would not, for everyone whom they will be regarded by them either as a brother or a sister, or a father or a mother, or a son or a daughter, or the child or parent of those who are thus connected with him. Capital, I said. But let me ask you once more. Shall they be a family name only, or shall they be in all their actions be true to the name? For example, in the use of the word father, would the care of a father be implied in the filial reverence, in duty and obedience to him, which the law commands, and the violator of these duties to be regarded as an impious and unrighteous person, and will not likely to receive much good either at the hands of God or of man? Are these to be or not to be the strains which the children will hear repeated in their ears by all citizens about those who are intimated to them but to be their parents and the rest of their kinsfolk? These, he said, and none other. For what can be more ridiculous than for them to utter the names of family ties with the lips only, and not to act in the spirit of them? Then in our city, the language of harmony and concord will be more often heard than any other. As I was describing before, when any one is well or ill, the universal world will be, with me it is well, or it is ill, was true. And agreeably to this mode of thinking and speaking, were we not saying that they will have the pleasures and pains in common? Yes, and so they will. And they will have common interests in the same things which they will alike call my own. And have this in common interest, they will have a common feeling of pleasure and pain. Yes, far more than so than another state. And reason of this, over and above the general constitution of the state, will be the guardians will have a community of women and children. That will be the chief reason. And this unity of feeling will be admitted to be the greatest good, as was implied in our own comparison of a well-ordered state to be the relation of the body and members when affected by pleasure or pain. Then that we acknowledge, and very rightly. Then the community of wives and children among our citizens is clearly the source of the greatest good to the state. Certainly, and this agrees with the other principle which we were affirming, that guardians were not to have houses or land or any other property. Their pay was to be their food, which they were to receive from other citizens, and they were to have no private expenses, for we intend them to preserve the true character of guardians. Right, he replied. Both the community of property and the community of families, as I am saying, tend to make them more truly guardians. They will not tear the city in pieces by differing about mine and not mine, each man dragging any acquisition which he has made into a separate house of his own, where he has a separate wife and children and private pleasures and pains, but all will be affected as far as may be by the same pleasures and pains, because they are all of one opinion about what is near and dear to them, and therefore they will tend towards a common end. And as they have nothing but their persons which they can call their own, suits and complaints will have no existence among them. They will be delivered from all those quarrels of which money or children or relations are the occasion. Of course they will. Neither will trials for assault or insult be ever likely among them. For all equals should defend themselves against equals, we shall maintain to be honorable and right. We shall make the protection of the persons a matter of necessity. That is good, he said. Yes, and there shall be further good in law, viz., that if a man has a quarrel with another, he will satisfy his resentment then and there, and not proceed to more dangerous lengths. Certainly. The elder shall be assigned the duty of ruling and chastising the younger. Clearly. Nor can there be doubt that the younger will not strike or do any other violence to an elder, unless the magistrate commands it, nor will he slight him in any other way. For there are two guardians, shame and fear, mighty to prevent him, shame, which makes men refrain from laying hands on those who are them in the relations of parents, fear that the injured one will be succored by the others, who are his brothers, sons, and fathers. That is true, he replied. Then in every way the laws will help the citizens to keep the peace with one another. Yes, there will be no want of peace. And the guardians will never quarrel among themselves. There will be no danger of the rest of the city being divided either against them or against one another. None whatsoever. I hardly like even to maintain the little meanness of which they will be ride, for they beneath notice. Such, for example, as the flattery of the rich by the poor, and all the pains and pangs which men experience at bringing up a family, finding money to buy necessities for their household, borrowing and then repudiating, getting how they can, and giving the money into the hands of women and slaves to keep. The many evils of so many which people suffer in this way are mean enough and obvious enough, and not worth the speaking of. Yes, he said, a man has no need of eyes in order to perceive that. In all form of evils they will be delivered, and
their life will be blessed as the life of Olympic victors, and yet more blessed. How so? The Olympic victor, I said, is deemed happy in receiving a part only of the blessedness which is secured to our citizens, who have won a more glorious victory, and have a more complete maintenance at the public cost. For the victory which they have won is the salvation of the whole state, and the crown which they and their children are crowned is the fullness of all the life's needs. They receive rewards from the hands of their country while living, and after death they have honor burial. Yes, he said, a glorious rewards they are. You remember, I said, how in the course of the previous discussion, someone who shall be nameless accused us of making our guardians unhappy. They had nothing and might be possessed all things, to whom we replied that, if an occasion offered, we might perhaps hereafter consider this question, but that, as present advised, would make our guardians truly guardians, and that we were fashioning the state with a view to the greatest happiness, not to any particular class, but of the whole? Yes, I remember. And what do you say, now that the life of our protectors is made out to be far better and nobler than the Olympic victors, is the life of the shoemakers, or any other artisans, or husbandmen, to be compared with it? Certainly not. And at the same time I ought to repeat what I had said elsewhere, that if our guardian shall try to be happy in such a manner that he will cease to be a guardian, and is not content with the safe and harmonious life, which, in our judgment, is of all lives the best, but infatuated by some youthful conceit of happiness, which gets up in his head, shall seek to appropriate the whole state to himself, then he will have to learn how wisely Hesiod said, when he said, half is more than the whole. If he were to consult me, I should say to him, stay where you are, when you have to offer of such a life. You agree, then, I said, that men and women are to have a common way of life, such as we have described, common education, common children, and they are to watch over citizens in common, whether abiding in the city or going out to war. They are to keep watch together, and hunt together like dogs, and always and in all things, as far as they are able, women are to share with the men, and in doing so, they will do what is best, and will not violate, but preserve the natural relations of the sexes. I agree with you, he replied. The inquiry, I said, has yet to be made whether such a community will be found possible, as among our other animals, so also among men, and if possible, in which way possible. You have anticipated the question which I was about to suggest. There is no difficulty, I said, in seeing how war will be carried on by them. How? Why, of course they will go on expeditions together, and they will take with them any of their children who are strong enough, that, after a manner of an artisan's child, They may look on at the work which they will have to do when they are grown up. Besides looking on, they will have to help and be in use of war, and to wait upon their fathers and mothers. Did you never observe in the arts how the potter's boy looked on and helped long before they touched the wheel? Yes, I have. And shall potters be more careful in educating their children, and in giving them the opportunity of seeing and practicing their duties than our guardians will be? The idea is ridiculous, you said. There is also the effect on the parents, with whom, as with other animals, the presence of their young ones will be the greatest incentive to valor. That is quite true, Socrates. And yet if they are defeated, may often happen in war, how great the danger is. The children will be lost as well as their parents, and the state will never recover. True, I said. But would you never allow them to run any risk? I am far from saying that. Well, but if they are ever to run a risk, should they not do so on some occasion if they escape disaster, they shall be better for it, clearly. Whether the future soldiers do or do not see war in the days of their youth is a very important matter, for the sake of which some risk must be fairly be incurred. Yes, very important. This, then, must be our first step, to make our children spectators of war, but we must also contrive that they shall be secured against danger, and all will be well. True. Their parents may be supposed not to be blind to the risks of war, but to know, as far as human foresight can, what expeditions are safe and what is dangerous. They may be assumed. And they will take them on the safe expeditions and be cautious about the dangerous ones? True. And they will place them under the command of experienced veterans who will be their leaders and teachers. Very properly. Still, the dangers of war cannot be always foreseen. There is a good deal of chance about them. True. Then, against such changes, the children must be at once furnished with wings, in order that the hour of their need they may fly away and escape. What do you mean? He said. I mean that we must mount them on horses in their earliest youth, and that when they have learned to ride, take them on horseback to see war. The horses must not be spirited and warlike, but must be trackable and yet at the swiftest that they can be had. In this way they will get an excellent view of what is hereafter to be their own business, and if there is any danger they have to only follow their elders' leaders and escape. I believe that you are right, he said. Next, as to war, what are the relations of your soldiers to one another and to their enemy? I should be inclined to propose that the soldier who leaves his rank, or throws away his arms, or is guilty of any other act of cowardice, should be degraded into rank of husbandman or artisan. What do you think? By all means, I should say. And he who allows himself to be taken prisoner may as well be made a present to his enemies. He is their lawful prey, and let them do what they like with him. Certainly. But the hero who has distinguished himself, what shall be done to him? In the first place, he shall receive honor in the army from his youthful comrades. Every one of them in succession shall crown him. What do you say? I approve. And what do you say of receiving the right hand of fellowship? To that, too, I agree. But will you hardly agree to my next proposal? What is your proposal? That he should kiss and be kissed by them. Most certainly. And I should be disposed to go further and say, let no one whom he has a mind to kiss refuse to be kissed by him while the expedition lasts. So that if there is to be a lover in the army, whether his love be youth or maiden, he may be more eager to win the prize of valor. Capital, I said. That the brave man is to have more wives than others has already been determined, and he is to have the first choice in such matters more than others, in order that he may have as many children as possible. Agreed. Again, there's another matter in which, according to Homer, brave youths should be honored, for he tells how Ajax, after he distinguished himself in battle, was rewarded with long chine, which seemed to be a compliment appropriate to a hero in the flower of his age, being not only a tribute of his honor, but a very strengthening thing. Most true, he said. Then this, I said, Homer shall be our teacher, and we too, at sacrifices and on like occasions, will honor the brave according to the measure of their valor, whether men or women, with hymns or the other distinctions which we were mentioning, also with seats of presidents and meats in full cups. And in honoring them, we shall be at the same time training them. That, he replied, is excellent. Yes, I said. And when a man dies gloriously in war, shall we not say, in the first place, that he is of the golden race? To be sure. Nay, we have not the authority of Hesiod for affirming that when they are dead. They are holy angels upon the earth, authors of good, averters of evil, the guardians of speech-gifted men. Yes, and we accept this authority. We accept his authority. We must learn of the gods how we are to order the sepulture of divine and heroic personages, and when it is to be their special distinction, we must do as he bids, by all means. And in ages to come we will reverence them, and kneel before the sepulchres as the graves of heroes. And not only that, they, but any who are deemed preeminently good, whether they die from age or in any other way, shall be admitted to the same honor. That is very right, he said. Next, how shall our soldiers treat their enemies? What about this? And what respect do you mean? First of all, in regards to slavery, do you think it's right for the Hellenists? Do you think it's right that Hellenists should enslave Hellenic states, or allow others to enslave them, if they can help? Should not their custom to be to spare them, considering the danger which they is that the whole race may one day fall under the yoke of the barbarians? To spare them is infinitely better. Then no Hellenin should be owned by them as a slave. That is the rule which they observe and advise the other Hellenists to observe. Certainly, he said. They will in this way be united against the barbarians, and will keep their hands off one another. Next, as to the slain, ought the conquerors, I said, to take anything but their armor? Do not the practice of despoiling an enemy afford an excuse for not facing the battle? Cowards skulk about the dead, pretending that they are fulfilling a duty, and many an army before now has been lost from this love of plunder. Very true. And is there not illiberality and avarice in robbing a corpse, and also the degree of meanness, womanishness, in making an enemy of the dead body, when the real enemy has flown away and left only his fighting gear behind him? Is not this rather like a dog who cannot get it at his assailant, quarreling with the stones which strike him instead? Very like a dog, he said. Then we must abstain from spoiling the dead or hindering their burial. Yes, he replied, we certainly must. Neither shall we offer up arms at the temples of the gods, least of all the armies of the Hellenists, if we care to maintain good feeling with other Hellenists, and indeed we have reason to fear that the offering of spoils taken from the kinsmen may be pollution, unless commanded by the god himself. Very true. Again, as to the devastation of the Hellenic territory, or the burning of houses, what is to be the practice? May I have the pleasure, he said, of hearing your opinion? Both should be forbidden, in my judgment. Produce, and no more. Shall I tell you why? Pray do. Why, you see, there is a difference in the names of discord and war, and I can imagine that there is also a difference in their nature. The one is expressive of what is internal and domestic, the other of which is external and foreign, and the first of the two is termed discord, and only the second war. That is a very proper distinction, he replied. And may I not observe with equal propriety that the Hellenic race is all united together by ties of blood and friendship, and alien and strange to the barbarian? Very good, he said. And therefore, when Hellenists fight with barbarians, and barbarians with Hellenists, then they will be described as us as being at war when they fight, and by nature enemies. This kind of antagonism should be called war. But when Hellenists fight with one another, we should call that Hellas is that in a state of disorder and discord, that being by nature friends, and such enemy is to be called discord. I agree. Consider then, I said, when that which we have acknowledged to be discord occurs, and the city is divided, if both parties destroy the land and burn the houses of one another, how wicked does the strife appear! No true lover of his country would bring himself to tear into pieces of his own nurse and mother. There must be reason in the conquering depriving the conquered of their harvest, but still they would have the idea of peace in their hearts, and would not mean to go on fighting forever. Yes, he said, that is a better temper than the other. And will not the city, which you are founding, be a Hellenic city? It ought to be, he replied. Then will not the citizens be good and civilized? Yes, very civilized. And will they not be lovers of Hellas, and think that Hellas as their own land, and share the common temples? Most certainly. And any difference which arise among them will be regarded as discourse only, a quarrel among friends, which is certainly not to be called a war. Certainly not. And then when they quarrel as those who intend some day to be reconciled, certainly. They will use friendly correction, but will not enslave or destroy their opponents. They will be correctors, not enemies. Just so. And as they are Hellenists themselves, they will not devastate Hellas, nor will they burn houses, not even suppose that the whole population of the city, men, women, and children, are equally their enemies. For they know that the guilt of war is always confirmed to a few persons, and that many are their friends. And for all the reasons they will be unwilling to waste their lands and raise their houses. Enmity to them will be only last until the many innocent sufferers have compelled the guilty few give satisfaction. I agree, he said, that our citizens should thus deal with the Hellenic enemies, and with the barbarians the Hellenes now deal with one another. Then let us enact this law also for our guardians, that they are neither to devastate the lands of the Hellenes, nor to burn their houses. Agree. And we may agree also in thinking that these, like all other previous enactments, are very good. But still I must say, Socrates, that if you allow it to go on in this way, you entirely forget that our other question, which is at the commencement of this discussion, you will thus thrust aside. Is such an order of things possible, and how, if at all? For I am quite ready to acknowledge that it's a plan which you propose, if only feasible, would do all sorts of good to the state. I will add, what you have admitted, that your citizens will be the bravest of warriors, and that never leave their ranks, for they will all know one another, and each will call one another father, brother, son. And if you suppose the women to join their armies, whether the samurai go to the rear, either as a terror of the enemy, or auxiliaries in the case of need, I know that they will then be absolutely invincible. And there are many domestic advantages, which might also be mentioned, and which I also fully acknowledge. But as I admit all these advantages, and as many more as you please, if only this state of yours were to come into existence, we need to say no more about them. Assuming that the existence of the state, let us now turn to the question of possibility and the way and means the rest may be left. If I loiter for a moment, if you instantly make a raid upon me, I said, and I have no mercy. I have hardly escaped the first and second waves, and you seem not to be aware that you're now bringing upon me a third, which is the greatest and heaviest. When you have seen and heard the third wave, I think you will be more considerate, and will acknowledge that some fear and hesitation with natural respecting a proposal so extraordinary as to which I have now to state and investigate. The more appeals of the sort which you make, he said, the more determined are we that you should tell us how such a state is possible. Speak out, and at once. Let me begin by reminding you that we found our way hither in search of after justice and injustice. True, he replied, but what of that? I was only going to ask whether, if we had discovered them, we are to require that the just men should in nothing fail of absolute justice, where we may be satisfied with an approximation, and the attainment in him of a higher degree of justice than is to be found in other men. The approximation will be enough. We are inquiring into the nature of absolute justice, and into the character of the perfectly just, into injustice in which perfectly unjust, that we might have an ideal. We were to look at in order that we may judge our own happiness and unhappiness according to the standard which they exhibited and the degree in which we resembled them, but not in any view of showing that they could exist in fact. True, he said. Would a painter be any the worse because, after delineated with consummate art an ideal of a perfectly beautiful man, he was unable to show that any such man could have ever existed? He would be none the worse. Well, and we're not creating an ideal of a perfect state, to be sure. And is our theory a worse theory because we are unable to prove the possibility of a city being ordered in a manner such described? Surely not, you replied. That is the truth, I said. But if, at your respect, I am to try to show how and under what conditions the possibility is highest, I must ask you, having this view, to repeat your former admissions. What admission? I want to know whether ideals are ever fully realized in language. Does not the word express more than the fact, and must not the actual, whether the man think, always, in the nature of things, fall short of the truth? What do you say? I agree. Then you must not insist on proving that the actual state will in every respect coincide with the ideal. If we are only able to discover how a city may be governed nearly as we proposed, you will admit that we have discovered the possibility which you demand, and will be contented. I am sure that I should be contented. Will not you? Yes, I will. Let me next endeavor to show what is the fault in the states, which is the cause of their present maladministration, and what is in the last change will enable a state to pass into the truer form, and let the change, if possible, be of one thing only, or, if not, of two. At any rate, let changes be as few and slight as possible. Certainly, he replied. I think, I said, that there may be a reform of the state if only one change were made, which is not a slight or easy, though still a possible one. What is it? He said. Now then, I said, I go to meet that which I liken to the greatest of the waves, yet shall the word be spoken, even though the wave break and drown me in laughter and dishonor. And do you mark my words? Proceed. I said, until philosophers or the kings and princes of this world have the spirit and power of philosophy, and the political greatness of wisdom meet in one, and those commoner natures who pursue either the exclusion of the other are compelled to stand aside, cities will never have rest from their evils, no, nor the human race, as I believe. And then only will this our state have a possibility of life and behold the light of the day. Such was the thought, my dear Glasson, which I would fain to have uttered if I had not seemed too extravagant. For to be convinced that no other state can there be happiness, private or public, is indeed a hard thing. Socrates, what do you mean? I would have considered that the word which you've uttered is one at numerous persons, and in very respectable persons too, in a figure pulling off their coats, and all in a moment, seizing any weapon that comes to hand, will run at you in might and maintain. But you know where you are, intending to do heavens knows what. If you don't prepare to answer and put yourself in motion, you will be heard by the fine wits, and no mistake. You got me into this scrape, I said, and I was quite right. However, I will do all I can to get you out of it. But if I can only give you goodwill and good advice, and, perhaps, I may be able to fit answers to your questions better than another, that is all. And now, having such an auxiliary, you must do your best to show the unbelievers that you are right. I ought to try, I said, since you offer me such invaluable assistance. And I think that, if there is to be a chance of our escaping, we must explain to them whom we mean when we say that philosophers are the rule in the state, and then we shall be able to defend ourselves. There will be discovered to be some natures who ought to study philosophy, and to be leaders in the state. Others who are not born to be philosophers, and are meant to be followers rather than leaders. Then now for a definition, he said. Follow me, I said, and I hope that I may in some way or other be able to give you a satisfactory explanation. Proceed. I dare say that you remember, and therefore I need not remind you, that a lover, if he is worthy of the name, ought to show his love, not to some one part of that which he loves, but to the whole. I really do not understand, and therefore beg of you to assist my memory. Another person, I said, might fairly reply as you do, but a man of pleasure like yourself ought to know that all who are in the flower of youth do somehow raise a pang or emotion in a lover's breast, and thought by him to be worthy of his affectionate regard. Is not this a way which you have with the fair? One has a snub nose, and you praise his charming face. The hook nose of another has, you say, a royal look, when he who is neither snub nor hooked has the grace of regularity. The dark visage is manly. The fair are children of the gods, and as to the sweet honey pale, as they are called, what is the very name but the invention of a lover who talks in diminutives, and is not averse to the paleness of appearing on the cheek of youth. In a word, there is no excuse for which you will not make, and nothing which you will not say, in order not to lose a single flower that blooms in the springtime of youth. If you make me an authority in matters of love, for the sake of argument, I assent. And what do you say of lovers of wine? Do you not see them doing the same? They are glad of any pretext of drinking any wine. Very good. And the same is true of the ambitious man. If they cannot command an army, they are willing to command a file, and if they cannot be honored by really great and important persons, they are glad to be honored by lesser and meaner people. But honor of the same kind they must have. Exactly. Once more let me ask, does he who desires any class of goods desire the whole class, or a part of only, the whole? And may we not say of the philosopher that he is a lover, not of a part of wisdom only, but of the whole? Yes, of the whole. And he who dislikes learning, especially in youth, when he has no power of judging what is good and what is not, such as one we maintain not to be a philosopher, or a lover of knowledge, just as he who refuses his food is not hungry, and may be said to have bad appetite, and not a good one. Very true, he said. Whereas he who has a taste for every sort of knowledge, and who is curious to learn and is never satisfied, may be justly termed a philosopher. Am I not right? Glaucon said, if curiosity makes a philosopher, you will find many a strange being will have a title to the name. All the lovers of sights have the delight in learning, and therefore must be included. Musical amateurs, too, are a folk strangely out of place among philosophers, for they are the last persons in the world who would come to anything like a philosophical discussion, if they could help, while they run about at the Dionystical festivals, as if they let out their ears to hear every chorus, whether the performance is in town or country. It makes no difference. They are there. Now we are to maintain that all these, and any who have similar tastes, as well as the professors of quite minor arts, are philosophers? Certainly not, I replied. They are only an imitation. He said, who then are the true philosophers? Those, I said, who are lovers of the vision of truth. That is also good, he said, but I should like to know what you mean. Rather, I replied, I might have a difficulty in explaining, but I am sure that you will admit a proposition which I'm about to make. What about the proposition that since beauty is the opposite of ugliness, they are two? Certainly. And inasmuch as there are two, each of them is one? True again. And of just and unjust, good and evil, and of every other class, the same remark holds. Taken singly, each of them is one, but from the various combinations of them, with actions and things and with one another, they are seen in all sorts of lights and appear many. Very true. And this is the distinction which I draw between the sight-loving, art-living, practical class and those whom I am speaking, and who are worthy of the name of philosopher. How do you distinguish them? He said. The lovers of sound and sights, I replied, are, as I conceive, fond of the fine tunes and colors and forms and all of the artificial products that are made out of them, but their mind is incapable of seeing or loving absolute beauty. True, he replied. Few are they who are able to attain the sight of this. Very true. And he who, having a sense of beautiful things, has no sense of absolute beauty, or who, if another leads him to a knowledge of that beauty, is unable to follow. Of such an one I ask, is he aware, or in a dream only? Reflect, is not a dreamer, sleeping or waking, one who likens dissimilar things, who puts the copy of place of the real object. I should certainly say that such an one was dreaming, but take the case of another, who recognizes the existence of absolute beauty, and is able to distinguish the idea from the objects which participate in this idea, neither putting the object in the place of the idea, nor the idea in the place of the object. Is he a dreamer, or is he awake? He is wide awake. And may not we say that the mind of one who knows has knowledge, and that the mind of the other, who opens only, has opinion? Certainly. But suppose that a latter should quarrel with us and dispute our statement. Can we administer any soothing cordial or advice to him, without revealing to him that there is sad disorder in his wit? We must certainly offer him some good advice, he replied. Come, then, and let us think of something to say to him. Shall we begin by assuring him that he is welcome to any knowledge which he may have, and that we are rejoiced at his having it? But we should like to ask him a question. Does he who have knowledge know something or nothing? You must answer for him. I answer that he knows something. Something that is or is not. Something that is. For how can that which is not ever to be known? And we are assured, after looking at the matter from many points of view, that absolute being is or may be absolutely known, but that is utterly non-existence is utterly unknown. Nothing can be more certain. Good. But if there's anything which is of such a nature as to be and not to be, that will be a place intermediate between pure beings and absolute negation of being. Yes, between them. And as knowledge corresponds to being and ignorance of necessity to not being, for that intermediate between being and not being, there has to be discovered a corresponding intermediate between ignorance and knowledge, if there be such. Certainly. Do we admit the existence of opinion? Undoubtedly. As being the same with knowledge, or another faculty. Then opinion and knowledge have to do with different kinds of matter corresponding to the difference of faculties. Yes. And knowledge is relative to being and knowing and knows being. But before I proceed further, I would make a division. What division? I will begin by placing faculties in a class by themselves. They are powers in us, and in all other things, by which we do as we do. Sight and hearing, for example, I should call faculty. Have I clearly explained the class which I mean? Yes, I quite understand. But then let me tell you about my view about them. I do not see them, and therefore the distinctions of figure, color, and the like, which enable me to discern the differences of some things, do not apply to them. In speaking of the faculty, I think that is only of its sphere and its result, and that which has the same sphere and the same result I call the same faculty, but that which has another sphere and another result I call different. Would that be your way of speaking? Yes. And will you be so very good as to answer one more question? Would you say that knowledge is a faculty, or in what class would you place it? Certain knowledge is a faculty, and the mightiest of all the faculties. And is opinion also a faculty? Certainly, he said. For opinion is that which we are able to form an opinion. And yet you were acknowledging a little while ago that knowledge is not the same as opinion. Why, yes, he said. How can any reasonable being ever identify that which is infallible with that which errs? An excellent answer, proving, I said, that we are quite conscious of the distinction between them. Yeah. And knowledge and opinion have distinct powers, have also distinct spheres or subject matters. That is certain. Being in the sphere or subject matter of knowledge, and knowledge is to know the nature of being. Yes. And opinion is to have an opinion. Yes. And do we know what we opine? Or is the subject matter of opinion the same as the subject matter of knowledge? Nay, he replied, that has already been disproven. If differences in faculty implies differences in sphere or subject matter, and if, as we were saying, opinion and knowledge are distinct faculties,
then a sphere of knowledge and an opinion cannot be the same. Then if being is the subject matter of knowledge, something else must be the subject matter of opinion. Yes, something else. Well then, is not being the subject matter of opinion? Or rather, how can there be an opinion at all about not being? Reflect. When a man has an opinion, has he not an opinion about something? Can he not have an opinion which is the opinion about nothing? Impossible. He who has an opinion has the opinion about some one thing? Yes. And not being is not one thing, but properly speaking, nothing? True. Of not being, ignorance was assumed to be the necessary correlative of being knowledge. True, he said. Then opinion is not concerned with either with being or not being, not with either, and can therefore neither be ignorance nor knowledge. That seems to be true. But is opinion to be sought without and beyond either of them, in the greater clearness than knowledge, or in a greater darkness than ignorance? Is in neither. Then I suppose that opinion appears to you to be darker than knowledge, or lighter than ignorance. Both, and in no small degree, and also to be within and between them. Yes. Then you would infer that opinion is intermediate, no question. But were you not saying before that if anything appears to be of the sort which, and is not at the same time, that sort of thing would appear also to lie in the interval between pure being and absolute not being, and that the corresponding faculty is neither knowledge nor ignorance, but will be found in the interval between them. True. And in that interval there has now been discovered something which we call opinion. There has. Then what remains to be discovered is the object which partakes equally of the nature of being and not being, and cannot rightly be termed either, pure and simple. This unknown term, when discovered, we may truly call the subject of opinion, and assign each to their proper faculty. The extremes of the faculties of the extremes, and the mean to the faculty of the mean. True. This being premised, I would ask the gentleman who is of the opinion that there is no absolute or unchangeable idea of beauty, in whose opinion the beautiful is the manifold. He, I say, your lover of beautiful sights, who cannot bear to be told that the beautiful is one, and the just is one, or that anything is one. To him I would appeal, saying, will you be so very kind, sir, as to tell us whether, of all these beautiful things, there is one which will not be found ugly, or of the just, which will not be found unjust, or of the holy, which will not also be found unholy? No, he replied, the beautiful will in some point of view be found ugly, and the same is true of the rest. And may not the many which are doubles be also halves, doubles, that is, of one thing, and halves of another? Quite true. And things great and small, heavy and light, and are termed, will not be denoted by these any more than the opposite name. True. Both these and the opposite names will also be attached to all of them. Can any one of these many things which are called by particular names be said to be this rather than not to be this? He replied, they are like cunning riddles, which are asked at feasts, or the children's puzzle about the eunuch aiming at the bat, with what he hit him, as they say in the puzzle, and upon what the bat was sitting. The individual object of which I am speaking are also a riddle, and have a double sense, nor can you fix them in your mind, either as being or not being, or both, or neither. Then what will you do with them? I said. Can they have a better place than between being and not being? For they are clearly not in the greatest darkness or negation than not being, or more full of light and existence than being. That is quite true, he said. Thus then we seem to have discovered that the many ideas which the multitude entertain about the beautiful and about all other things are tossing about in some region which is halfway between pure being and pure not being. We have. Yes. And we had before agreed that anything of this kind which we might find was to be described in a matter of opinion, and not as a matter of knowledge, being intermediate flux, which is caught and detained by the intermediate faculty. Quite true. Then those who see many beautiful, and who yet neither see absolute beauty, nor can follow any guide which points the way thither, who sees the many just and not absolute justice, and the like, such persons may be said to have opinion but not knowledge. That is certain. But those who see absolute and eternal and immutable may be said to know, and not to have opinion only. Neither can that be denied. The one love and embrace the subjects of knowledge, the others those of opinion. The latter are the same, as I dare say you will remember, who listened to sweet sounds and gazed upon fair colors, but would not tolerate the existence of absolute beauty. Yes, I remember. Shall we then be guilty of impropriety in calling them lovers of opinion rather than lovers of wisdom? And will they be very angry with us for thus describing them? I shall tell them not to be angry. No man should be angry at what is true. Those who love the truth in each thing are to be called lovers of wisdom, and not lovers of opinion, assuredly.